Hello and welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good, the bad, and the ugly of how Hollywood chose the 20th century's most momentous event. My name is Dr. Rob Citino, senior historian here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. And today I'll be filling in for our regular host, Seth Perrodin, historian and digital content manager. As always, we're sitting down with
Dr. Christelle Lefaucheur, research historian at the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy.
Our special guests for today's episode are Dr. Martin Loicano, Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy.
Doesn't get any better than that.
It really doesn't, Martin. And Dr. Marsha Gordon, visiting us here in New Orleans from North Carolina State University, Professor of Film Studies at NCSU. Marsha, welcome to New Orleans.
Thank you for having me.
Today we'll be discussing the 1946 film The Best Years of Our Lives, directed by William Wyler. The film is set around the story of three United States servicemen returning from World War II and attempting to readjust to civilian life. The film stars Myrna Loy, the Queen of Hollywood, Frederick March, Dana Andrews, Teresa Wright, Virginia Mayo, and an amazing performance from a non-actor by the name of Harold Russell, who we'll be talking about a lot. The movie won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director for Wyler, Best Actor for Frederick March, Best Supporting Actor for Russell, and Best Adapted Screenplay. So let's just delve right in, gang. The question we normally start with when we talk about these films is how accurate is this film? Now, given that this is not a film about real events, but in fact about archetypal characters, how much does this film nail the subject that it's trying to portray?
So I don't know that I can answer that in some ways, but I can in others, because if you look at the critical reception at the time the film came out, which I think is really important when we're asking these questions about how things were received and how they reflected on the moment. Bosley Crowther, writing in the New York Times, for example, was complaining in his review that social problem, social issue films had not been at the fore in the year prior. This film came out, and he said this just took a very serious subject seriously, basically, and did a wonderful job of actually dealing with an important issue that in our country at the time. General Omar Bradley, who was the head of the VA, at the time this film came out, wrote a letter to Sam Goldwyn, the producer, praising the film and thanking him for making it. And so I think that those kinds of reactions indicate not so much that this film, obviously it's not a documentary, it's a fiction film, but that it was dealing with these issues of returning home in a fashion that was, if not necessarily accurate, instructive, useful for having a conversation and for people thinking about their own lives.
Thanks, Marsha.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the things you said, but I think there's something very valuable about the fictional aspect of the film, because a lot of people who were veterans didn't want to be associated with these tropes, even though they were incredibly accurate and very frequent and a problem that many, many people suffered some variant of the presentations we saw there. But as we know from the museum with our oral histories, people still often don't want to talk about their experience in these terms, and ultimately they do, but it sometimes takes decades or generations before people of the World War II era were ready to admit their problems were this hard. So I think it gives a safe distance to be able to give some reality through the lens of fiction.
As opposed to a biographical approach, a specific character.
Yeah, and you have there's an agenda, right, loaded with the biography. If you don't want to be the broken veteran, certainly not immediately after the good war. You don't want to be the person who came home and had problems. That wasn't what the anticipation, the expectations, both socially and amongst the veteran community were. It's we did our job, we did our best, now it's time to put it down and go back to work. That was the trope. So you didn't want to be singled out as the one who wasn't singing that kind of a company song, I think. Certainly not in the 1940s.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I agree with Martin and Marsha and Rob. The film is interesting, and I agree that choosing a kind of a genre, which we could argue what genre it is, but I will say it's a melodrama, which is an interesting flipping of what the melodrama is, because usually it's centered around women, and in this case is around men. I think it's very effective for reasons we can discuss later, but also the fact that it's not solely focused on one veteran, and then I would really narrow it down to one particular experience, and maybe leading some veteran to either reject that or not identify it or not embrace. Here we have 3 very different ones, different age, different class, different moment in their life, and I think it's very effective for that, and very accurate in the idea and in some of the experience of the veteran. And coming back to what Marsha was saying about the reception, what's interesting is that a lot of reviewers use terms like honesty, honesty, realism, but also civic contribution. Like the film was doing an important job in kind of representing the veteran, but I think also kind of easing some of the fears that the civilians or the one that did not participate really had at that moment.
Of soldiers coming back?
Yes.
If I could just add one thing to what Christelle was saying, I think it's really interesting that you brought up the idea of melodrama, because it also guaranteed that a female audience, right, which is how melodramas were conceived as women's pictures, could find a way into this film, because obviously the women on the home front were a very key part of this kind of coming home rehabilitation into quote-unquote normal life. And so they kind of needed to, in some ways, figure out a way to speak to the female audience as well as to the male audience.
My take on the sort of accuracy question of this film is I just can't help comparing it to another movie that came out in 1946, It's a Wonderful Life. The movies are parallel in many ways. In fact, they share a kind of pool of actors. There's the bank auditor, and It's a Wonderful Life is also a banker in Best Years of Our Lives. And you talk about honesty. It's a Wonderful Life didn't really win a big audience at the time. It has since won a colossal audience, and the Christmas crowd, people watch it every year over and over again, my family amongst them. But at the time, it just didn't ring honestly with people in the way that apparently Best Years of Our Lives did have just the feel of authenticity. Martin, I think you're onto something, too, that not everyone will want to admit that they were that person, that they were one of these three people, but by making these characters kind of archetypes, I think it's easier to identify them with them in a way much easier than it would be if these were real characters, real names, real biographies. I think Weiler did a really solid job on that.
And by the way, I assume we all talk about the experience of the veteran. I think the depiction of women too, I think it's very interesting. Again, there's almost a parallel. We have three major male characters. We could argue we have three major female characters. So also from Weiler's side and Goldwyn, like kind of an attempt to address some of the fear of the veterans. What was my wife doing while I was gone, which was very, very common. And so we have, the one that didn't stay very faithful.
Marie.
Yeah, the wife, and then the daughter who engaged herself, who, become a nurse, treat already is familiar or has dealt with veterans or with soldiers before. So there's an interesting kind of a mirroring parallel in the depiction. So.
Which character says this is? I gave it the best years of my life. It's this very best years of my life. It's an interesting thing.
It's Mary.
Yeah.
It's Mary.
It's Mary
the unfaithful.
The woman on the home front.
Yes.
Yeah, but the important aspect is that it's unclear what Hal's wife was doing during the war. We know that Mary was working, and she makes a really strong argument about, you left, I had to work.
And I was very successful.
And I was very successful, exactly. Peggy, of course, was working too. Yeah, it's unclear. I guess because she had two children. I forgot Myrna Loy's characters.
She's Millie.
Millie, yeah. It's unclear what she was doing. I don't think she was working. So I guess she stayed home, which, again, we need one of those in the story. We need a stay-home wife/mother who, take care of the children, who look so tall and big and not need to be taken care of.
The high school boy looks like 21.14.
I know.
It was like 25.14.
It's like, yeah.
The film, let's say at its heart, is about readjusting to civilian life. What elements go into that readjustment? I'll just throw that open to anybody who wants to take it. What elements go into this readjustment? What's so difficult about it? Martin, you've already introduced the word the trope, and for me, the trope about World War II is everybody came home and it was pretty easy, and we all know it. They all got a parade. My father came home from World War II. I said, "Where was my parade?" So we know that not everyone did, but we still hear that. The World War II soldiers and sailors and everything, they came home and the country was behind them. It was a parade and everyone welcomed them back. But that's not what this movie shows. What does it show?
No, and I'll just jump to that very, very early transition, which is so powerful with Fred Derry, as they're guiding the group of three veterans back through the air terminal at the the airport and they're getting on the old B-17 and they're flying out. He's so clearly the leader. He corrals the group. He's the charismatic commander. He's got command presence. He's encouraging the others. He's letting them know things are going to be all right. And you kind of develop this artificial sense like, oh, he's going to go back. He's going to have, a lovely home, and he's going to live in a nice neighborhood, and he's a successful guy. He's so handsome and tall and just exudes command. And I just love that initial transition that tells you, actually, no, that this is a guy that's living on the skids in a dump with his parents and a wife that's not too happy with him. And it's just, I love that transition because it goes from you expect him to be almost stereotypically successful leading man, and he, in many ways, he's the one that has the hardest time.
And and he was a soda jerk before the war, right? And he goes off and he wears the uniform, and it gives him this kind of gravitas and this sense of professionalism and accomplishment that Marie finds very charming. She wants him to wear his uniform when they go out on that first night on the town as he's spending all of his money before he has to go back to work, basically back where he started. And so there's this sense of he has made all of this kind of progress, but it doesn't count back on the home front. And so he's actually the one on that beautiful scene on the plane ride home that he talks about being nervous out of the service. It's this kind of great line that he says because he can see the anxiety on the plane with the men thinking about what's happened since they've been away.
Marie puts that uniform back on. Marie says, you look like yourself again.
Yeah.
It's just really a great ironic note.
Well, there's a Hal, too. So coming back to your question, Rob, there's, finding a job, and I think Martin hinted at, how it's difficult. There's Hal, which is being integrated in the family again. And I really, I have a very deep fondness for Hal, Frederick March. So Hal, coming back and really being he looks tired, he looks washed up. He's really, of all three, he just has the again, coming back to what Martin was saying, while Fred looks the most successful one, Hal looks really like he's struggling. And then they're in the plane and he talks about going home, and this anxiety comes up, and he say, I feel like I'm going to hit a beach, And then he talks about the thing that scares me the most is that everyone is going to try to rehabilitate me.
What about that first night home, Al and his family? I mean, is that trying to pack 4 years of action or 3 years of action, however long he's been gone, into a single evening? That scene really, really touched me. The wife thinks he looks borderline losing his mind. She's tolerating it. The daughter's tolerating it, but Al looks like he's on the edge.
Well, and this kind of brings us to another issue, which is the kind of transitional issue between what Martin was talking about on the plane and this kind of coming home and what do you do when you get home, which is these men are so comfortable around other men. I mean, that sense of camaraderie and community they have, and if you remember, it's like, oh, should we stop at the bar before we go home? I mean, they should be really anxious just to get home, but there's this question of maybe it'd be easier if we went and had a few drinks, and that's how Al deals with his coming homeness, right? Is like, okay, we're not going to stay home, we're going to go out on the town, and they end up in this night of kind of drunken, going bar and club hopping until the men finally kind of end up back together again at Butch's bar.
Graduate of an all-boys high school here, too, so I know exactly what these men are talking about, at least in a previous lifetime of mine. I think that it strikes me, Al, it does look like the one who's going to have the hardest time getting back into civilian life, Christelle. I think you're right about that. Martin, I think you're absolutely right on. Dana Andrews is every inch the warrior. He looks every inch the warrior. Looking good in that Ike jacket, it fits him perfectly. People are naturally gravitated. He appears to have a certain kind of leadership skill that perhaps the others don't. But, it's for me, Fred is one thing and Al is another thing, but this movie is really about Homer. The character that I think is the one who's most unforgettable, as I say, a non-actor actually won an Academy Award. I think he won a pair of Academy Awards for this, a special award, and then actually won the best supporting actor award. What's going on with Homer? I mean, his physical disability is obvious. He's had both his hands blown off. What else is going on inside that character? What is Wyler trying to tell us about him?
Well, first off, I think it's worth noting how Wyler came to cast him in the film, which is that Wyler saw him in a 1945 documentary short made by the Army Signal Corps called Diary of a Sergeant, which is an incredibly interesting film. You can find it online at the National Archives and stream it there. And that film itself is a kind of argument about the power of educational films, because it uses this earlier Meet McGonagall film from 1944 about a veteran getting accustomed to disability. But it's a film that's all about the way the government is taking care of its veterans. And I think that's an important thing to note, that that's where Harold Russell gets discovered and brought into this film. And his performance, not of disability, but ability, to me, is what's so powerful about this film. And it's the thing, if there's like one thing that really stands out to me, that is it, that this is someone who is using these hooks for hands, and so much of the film is about him not wanting to be looked at differently, not wanting to be treated differently, but also having to come to terms with the fact that he is different, especially when it comes to his relationship with his girlfriend, that he kind of goes through this arc of really struggling. He doesn't want to be the pitied one who she's with because she feels bad for him. And so a lot of this is them getting to the point where he can reconcile his own insecurity with her acceptance and love for him. And she's one of the good women, right, whose love knows no kind of bounds with regard to what's happened to him at war.
I take it you support his Best Supporting Actor Oscar for this?
Yeah, I think it's the best performance in the film, and that's saying something given the fact that he had absolutely no professional training. I mean, what he does in the Signal Corps documentary is just, be himself. And in fact, he's really kind of just being a version of himself in this film. But so much of it has to do with his aptitude and adjustment to these prosthetic devices that he uses for hands. And I mean, there's a lot of scenes in the film where he's playing a piano, or he's picking up a glass, once failing in that process in the Signal Corps short, but just shooting a gun, showing that he is able to do all of these things, even though he's got this kind of hook instead of hands.
I have to say, I would agree, yes, he deserved the Oscar. I would agree he's the really memorable part and story arc. So we have, those 3 different stories, or 4 depending. I was a little disappointed that the script, does not mention anything about working or about using the GI Bill, which the documentary mentioned. So he, and he had a pretty good career. He got a degree in business. He had a consulting firm that helped veterans, and then Kennedy appointed him as vice chairman of the President's Committee on Employment of the Handicapped. And the film really, is as if the rehabilitation of the veteran only happens in the domestic sphere. So you need to get married. You need to re-enter the family unit to kind of find your place again. Like this whole arc is about, it's about finally getting married to Vilma. And while, it's moving, and maybe the female audience, was the target, or maybe there's an element of, for the wounded veteran, I will never be able to find a wife because of what happened to me. So I understand the thinking behind that. But, there's a film that came the year before called Pride of the Marines, based on the real story of Hal Schmidt. And he was blinded. And a similar arc in the end, he doesn't want the girlfriend, he pushes her, and then eventually they get married. But there is talks within the movie of other veterans that came back and have occupation and have jobs and are self-sufficient. And I would have liked this film to mention that a little bit. It seems like he has no real future except being married and playing the piano at the bar.
And I think getting a government check, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
$200 a month.
200
$200 a month for the rest of my life.
Yeah,
Martin,
really the comparison starts there. I think it's a very interesting character. I think it's beautifully played, and I think he's not just a conceptual center. I think this guy was such a compelling human being, as he actually was, that you can almost see some of the actors kind of losing their talent a little bit and just sort of being in awe of this guy as they watch him maneuver through this film and all of the things that he's able to do and the attitude that he does it with. He's just such a remarkably resilient person who he's portraying this vulnerability, but at the same time you see all of these other characters reacting to him in such a powerful way as though they're inspired, maybe a little humbled by their sense of disability compared to what he's dealing with and how well he's dealing with it. I think there's some really powerful interactions that happen because of that. And maybe it's a bit of a device that he's not working, because then he might not be available for every scene for the others to play off to the extent that he does, that makes it such a remarkable film.
But it is a really interesting, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, Christelle, because it is interesting that he's completely excluded from that process, because part of it is showing how competent he is, with the hooks. And then what does that competency allow him to do, right? I'm really moved by the scene in the film where his father helps him remove his prosthetic hands. It's when he's going to bed at night. And he's just in his pajamas, and we see this process. And then later in the film, he shows Wilma what it's like for him to go through the same process. And it's this incredibly vulnerable moment of really stripping him down to this place of where he's really showing his deepest insecurities. And of course, she's incredibly accepting. He says, I'm as dependent as a baby. And it's a very moving moment, but it's also the moment at which they kiss for the first time in the film. And that comes 2.5 hours in. So this is a deferred moment of acceptance. And it's the moment when he has revealed himself that it's able to kind of complete this melodramatic arc, right, which is part of, Christelle, what you brought up in the beginning, and that's what facilitates the happy ending.
By the way, sorry, it was a good scene that, Wyler and Golding had a lot of trouble with the censorship because you had two, obviously, individually like each other in the bedroom
Unmarried,
together,
both
unmarried, and the script was saying they kiss passionately, and Brain was like, no passion.
Right.
Detail. You can cut that out, but I thought it was interesting that they had really to fight for this scene.
There's that scene in the in between all these very poignant scenes too, in which, the little kids are peeking in on Homer and Wilma, and he kind of loses it for a moment. It's like a monstrous scene in which he crashes his hooks through the window and say, you want to look at the freak or whatever it is.
Yeah, they refer to him as a freak, and he's so, that is the one thing that he can't abide by, is being thought of as different and being pitied and being mocked. And so that's I guess the other side of the vulnerability equation with him.
Right.
There's also an interesting little moment where he cleaned the gun and the gun is right under his chin, and Wilma is like, I hope it's not loaded, which it's never said, but basically the implication of the fear is that, is he going to take his own life, which I think for a lot of veterans was also, an issue or a question. So I think they dealt with that, quite nicely.
And, let me just add one more thing, which is Al Stevenson, the character played by Frederick March, says when they're dropping him off at home for the first time, because they leave him, that they couldn't train him to put his arm around his girl or stroke her hair. And so this, I think this establishes that through line that, look, Homer is going to be treated in this one particular way. He's not going to be concerned about work and career, that this is really focusing it, but also that that the government may have cared for him enough to rehabilitate him physically, but there's really no way you can teach someone those kind of like life social skills in readjusting to civilian life.
That scene with him in the shed, that is powerful stuff. Here's a guy who's obviously got some troubles, and he's having real problems readjusting. He's starting to spend a lot of time by himself, keeping to himself a lot, playing with rifles in the shed. If this movie were made in 1976 or 1986, we'd expect something horrible to be coming out of that scene. It's bad enough, his reaction to the little girl, and that's a dramatic scene to me. But again, it's not quite as horrific as it would be if this movie were made a few decades up the road. But we're talking so much about the individual characters right now. I think probably some discussion of the context. Another of the sort of traditional beliefs is that, some good years. U.S. servicemen came home to good years, that these were good years for the country. And we always say, we own 60% of the world's gold supply and 82% of the world's industrial production. We hadn't been bombed, so on and so on and so forth. Sort of dispels the belief that these were particularly good years for the United States of America, doesn't it? Isn't that a theme that Wyler's playing with here as well?
Yeah, I think that's part of why we have a bank sort of fairly central to this whole thing. It's like we'll get to the speech, but there's more to life than money, and there's quality of life issues that are being discussed in what I think is really a pretty compellingly contemporary way. That's why I think in so many ways this film holds up so well, is because it's really about enduring issues of humanity and what matters most. Your well-being, size of your wallet, your fiscal success, or your ability to be happy with the people around you. I think that's really kind of enduring and compelling about this film.
What does Al's son ask him almost immediately when what's Al's son's first question to Al?
Hiroshima.
Yeah, hey, what was Hiroshima? I heard you were in Hiroshima.
Yeah.
See any after effects of radiation there? Al seems kind of stunned by the question.
Yeah. But even when they ride the plane, I think they have a. Is it when they're coming in? You know, what are your plans? And it's like, oh, you know, just a normal life. Just and somebody say, you know, be able to take my girl out or something like that. So they're not expecting much, but they're expecting a minimum, which obviously some of them are struggling to achieve. I mean, the post-war boom also, you know, was not shared by everybody equally. Of course, there's not a lot of ethnic or how should I say, African American in the film. This is I think it was filmed in Los Angeles and Iowa or something like that. Des Moines
is what one hears. Although one also hears that inspired by Cincinnati. There's some central white bread central
City.
American Boone's, the mythical Boone City.
It's a luggage porter and there's a bathroom attendant. If there's anybody else, they're hiding pretty well in that one.
But I mean, I do think, just to kind of speak to your question, Rob, that this is a film that is first and foremost about change, and about change that happens incredibly abruptly. I mean, so much of this film is about all of these men are coming home at once. And how does a society that has been existing without these men reacclimate? And that's all those tensions are everywhere. They're in the workplace, they're in the home. So it's really about trying to figure out how the entire kind of social order is going to accommodate this thing that happens like pretty quickly. All right, virtually overnight, this kind of flooding back of men into the workforce and the expectation of women, you know, leaving their jobs if they had them to make space for the men, and anxieties about men who have jobs, having them taken away by veterans coming back to their posts if they have been held for them. So that all of that kind of tension about change, I think, is really palpable throughout the film.
There are a lot of talk about, references at least, to the possibility of another depression. I think there's 3 or 4 references in this film, which would be incredibly powerful to an audience in 1946. That was only 10 years ago. I mean, they'd been living through that in a relatively brief time ago. Soldiers in the war, late in the war when it seemed like it was going to go on forever, they'd often say, if you're in the Pacific, Golden Gate in 48. In other words, back home in 1948, breadline in 49. It's kind of a saying amongst troops at the front, and specifically in the Pacific theater here. And you see those, you hear talk about depression, you hear about the Cold War, Son's talking about the bomb, people are talking about someone at one point references, can't remember which character, and knew there'll be another war and it's going to kill us all. And so obviously talking about some kind of nuclear war. There's that. The genre is melodrama. I agree. There's this sort of political undercurrent. It's often not done through direct dialogues, through random comments, some headlines that you see. But I think it's a pretty interesting portrayal of the times.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I would argue, the film is a pretty sharp critic of capitalism. Fred comes back, and now the place he works is called Midway, like totally taking famous terms, and then he's selling product that he knows are completely useless and overpriced. And then his supervisor, is it skinny or slimy? Sticky. Before he gets hired, it's like, nobody's job is safe with all those veterans coming back. Which, of course, the implication that he hasn't gone to war. He stayed there. But he has a better job now because he stayed there and didn't go to war.
It's not Sticky anymore. It's Mr.
Yes,
whatever.
Exactly. So, again, this tension of, people that have continued and possibly moved up, and then what's going to happen with all those veterans coming back.
But I think that that's also an important part of this film, and I think it's why it still resonates today, is that it's not just a sunny film, right? It's not just a film that resolves all of the conflicts, even though it has the wedding at the end that brings Wilma and Homer together, and the successful putting of the ring on the finger. It does not just ease over all of the other anxieties and tensions and render them, kind of unimportant. The fact that it gives them some kind of visibility and voice throughout the film, I think, is part of what makes it seem modern, that it's not just painting this kind of ridiculously easy picture of post-war life in America.
So it's not A Wonderful Life.
It's a Wonderful Life. It's pretty dark, as you know. There's a lot of darkness
there is.
in this time period.
Yeah, Al, we don't know what's going to happen to Al. I mean, Fred obviously has a new job. Homer is happily married. We haven't really found out what happened to Hal after his speech, and then, he's attending the wedding, but we don't know if he hasn't stopped drinking. So he's still the troubled one.
That's Christelle. These are good points. I look at this film and you have Homer, who is literally the boy next door. His girlfriend is literally the girl next door. You have Al, who's living in a deluxe apartment in the sky. You have Fred, who is literally from the other side of the tracks. Martin, you say he lives in a dive, but it's on the other side of the tracks. Every time he's there, we see a train go by in the background. Is there something here that is Wyler trying to communicate some higher truth here about, does social class have something to do with this? Does wealth have something to do with it? They're all wounded in various ways, but they seem to have sort of different arcs of sliding back into something approaching a routine of civilian life.
Well, yeah, I'd take it in a slightly different direction, which dovetails off of Christelle, which I think that there's something being said about the injustice of the whole thing, this inability of Fred's skills to transfer. And it's not only that he's not valuable or he's not valued, it's that, Stinky there is Sticky. I call him Stinky.
Just in the interest of historical accuracy.
I call him Slimy. So
Slimy. So anyway,
obviously we don't like this.
Sticky Merkel, Mr. Merkel now.
Mr. Merkel there, who is obviously it's suggested, I think, he gets ahead because he's a bootlicker. I mean, we don't see any obvious competence or anything exceptional, and that's such a contrast to Fred, again, who's this presence of leadership and sort of comes in with this aura of command. So I think it's a wider lesson or a wider teaching point about this isn't fair. Like, maybe there's a certain kind of equality and rationality that these men found in the war that's now absent, and maybe there's something a little bit artificial and a little bit unfair about the way the world's working in Boone City.
What does Fred know how to do, Martin?
Lead. Knows how to lead.
He says one other thing, too. I know how to drop bombs on a target.
Yeah, but it's interesting because when he talks to the new manager, he says, "But have you done this?" "No, I just drop bomb." "Have you done that?" "No, I just drop bomb." "Have you led men?" "No." And we know it's untrue. We know he actually led men. Yes. Yeah. And he's like, nope, nope, nope.
Doesn't toot his own horn, and he could. Executed under the highest kind of pressure, made decisions. Mm-hmm. We know from his citation later that this is a guy who can operate under any level of pressure and difficulty.
But we also know that he feels shame about being back in that drugstore, right? I mean, this is not just, that kind of, that look on his face when he goes in there and when he finally kind of decides that this is what he has to do because he needs a job, and then being taken under the underling's wing, Stinky's wings, and this sense of being humiliated by being returned to that former status. And I would suspect a lot of veterans coming back who had to go back to positions that they felt like they had advanced would have really seen that and recognized that and felt kind of moved by that.
Oh yeah, and he mentioned he was making $400 and now he's at $32.50. So it's yeah.
Having been an assistant professor in 1984, I know all about $32.50 a week. I just want to state that for the record. Is there something else though? I mean, Marsha, I agree. Clearly, Fred doesn't want to be back in that soda shop, but something else is troubling Fred.
Yeah,
and we know that.
Yeah, I mean, he has these nightmares, right? We see the PTSD manifest, and Marie has no patience for them whatsoever. I mean, I think she says something like, can't you get those things out of your system?
Get over it.
Come
more
on,
or less, in modern
you've been home
Move
2
on.
days. What's taking so long? And he also, there's that scene where he doesn't show any regard for his citations, right? And it takes his father, after he leaves, his father reading one out loud to his wife, this incredibly moving kind of narrative of what he did and his accomplishment. That's the first time we really hear it, right? Because Fred's not talking about it. And he, he's like walking away from this document and from this part of his life because all of a sudden it has no relevance in the world that he's living in, right?
Talked to a number of veterans over the course of my career, and I've heard that story a lot. They got decorated for some incredible act of heroism. They got the paperwork, they got the hardware to prove it, and they're just really not interested. And often it's relatives who uncover it or discover it or want to share it with people, and sometimes that can be a very painful moment for the veteran, him or herself. And I've seen that a few times. That scene rang particularly true for me just based on based on people I've spoken with over the years.
I mean, it's literally another world, right? I mean, that's the whole point. That was there, and this is kind of now back in this other, and it seems to me that part of what this film is really doing is suggesting that you have to have this kind of radical break with that world, that to cling to it is not productive because it's actually not really informing and useful to your new reality, which is really your old reality.
Is it possible for Americans or home front in this case, is it possible for the home front to really understand? I mean, America was fortunate in World War II as the one great power that was really suffered very little, almost no physical destruction outside of some territories. I'm thinking of bombing of Pearl Harbor or other Pacific territories, but America was largely untouched compared to what happened to the cities of Germany, what happened in Japan in the last 6 months of the war. Was it possible for Americans to really fathom what a guy like Fred had been through?
No. I mean, no. There's just really no other simple answer to that, because this was not only so far removed from American history for 1917, 1918, but it's brief and then it's over. So, I mean, I think this level of combat, that sustained, that intensity of industrial warfare that had been endured, even some of the World War I vets may not be able to identify with that intensity of having to do it 42, 43, 44, into 45, that the endurance with which these gentlemen had to stay on the front lines and had to continue to slog all the way to the end of the war. It's unprecedented. So there really isn't, even in your domestic veteran community, anybody to connect and be a voice for you.
And I would add to that I think there's two other factors. One is, as you mentioned, Rob, the veterans themselves did not talk a lot. And second is almost the competition with the film industry of a certain imagery of what they went through, which is, as we know, as we talk often on this podcast, is rarely accurate or realistic in any way.
Do tell.
And so it's like, they come back where, yes, the home front, the only knowledge or understanding that the home front has of what's happening to them is through letters, which are so censored that they can't really say what's happening. Them coming back, rarely wanting to talk about it because it was traumatic, because it was exhausting, because they want to move on and they want to, have a new life or a better life. And then again, there's those images that are populating the popular culture. And so, yeah, I don't think anybody can understand. And I have to say, as you can recognize from my accent, being a French citizen, I have noticed there's also a different sensibility around World War II, countries that have been occupied or have suffered really lots of destruction. There's different ways of thinking about it and talking about it than here in the States.
Well, and I think if you think about what we see in Best Years of Our Lives, we have Fred's nightmares, we have Al's drinking, we have the display of Homer's body as evidence of what's happened to them, but there is not a single conversation between the men or between the men and their womenfolk about what happened and what they went through. So we don't get any indication that that's even something that you would do. I mean, think about what a different film it would have been if each of those men sat down and talked about the war and what they went through. And I think that's part of what makes this film feel like it's really about moving on, right, and getting past. And then maybe in that way, that's something we could think about a little bit critically about it, that it didn't really open up if this is a kind of modeling of post-war life, which I think it is in some ways, that was not something that was modeled.
Al is an interesting character again. He's wealthy. He's got a beautiful wife, 2 kids. They have a wonderful apartment. He's obviously doing very well for himself. The family hasn't done that badly for themselves in his absence. They've lost their maid. It's a first world problem. They've lost their maid. That is said, but he's got demons and he is self-medicating. He's wealthy enough to self-medicate, obviously, in a very high level way, and he's drinking almost from the beginning of the movie to the very end. The epicenter of Al's drinking, of course, is the great banquet scene. How many of you love that scene as much as I did? I thought it was one of the.
Love it.
I thought it was just a tour de force. What's up with Al? Why is there suddenly that explosion at the banquet? What does he say there?
I'm going first. Great.
Sure.
I think in some ways he's the ambassador of the slighted, angry veteran for the first half of this speech, where he's really coming in, like, just looking around this room of privilege with, I think, an angry sergeant's eyes. I mean, he's 25th Infantry, he's Tropic Lightning. We see that patch repeatedly. This is a guy who, and that meant something, right? Like in 1945, 46, people knew that patch. They knew what those guys had done in the Pacific Theater. So I think, at least for that first half of the speech, he's kind of the representative of the disgruntled veteran, reminding people of what's real. What's real is what I just got done doing in the Pacific. It's not collateral and loans and playing with numbers.
What kind of collateral does Al want to see in a applicant for a loan? He says so in the film. He's got to be in your guts or in your heart. I don't care if you have any guy he interviews, Novak, who comes in for a loan, doesn't even know what collateral means.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is about questioning the ethos of the bank based on this kind of veteran's credibility, which is veteran to veteran, and that's Al's whole point. What I love about that banquet scene is that the key character who is observing this scene is Millie, his wife, who is, if you remember, counting his drinks on the tablecloth and getting increasingly anxious. And then when Al starts making this speech, I mean, you can just see her go, oh no. But then what he says is so right and so powerful. What's so incredible about that scene is seeing Millie go, okay, you know, he is still here and he's right, even if he's got a drinking problem, which is basically also part of what's happening in that scene. But that kind of transformation from her being just worried about him making a fool of himself to that kind of affirmation of his values.
But it's almost like, yes, he's drunk and he makes a beautiful speech, but he, in an interesting twist, he actually almost I assume he achieves his goal, because he puts the bank owner kind of against the wall by announcing that we're going to work with veterans and small business. And, his boss doesn't look very happy, but what can he do now? So I want, when I said earlier, we don't know what's going to happen to him, I wonder if he really has achieved that, what he really obviously was very passionate about. It's also the first time we see him drunk, but passionate about something, and having, maybe this is his salvation, quotation mark, salvation, that the thing he can find a purpose coming back, which is, I'm going to help those veterans. I'm going to, help them with the loan, and then when you grow your farm, I'll come and get some of the tomatoes, and I'm going to rebuild something. I don't think it's luck that all par hasard. How do you say par hasard? It just happened that the gentleman that comes from London wants to have a farm. There's also something.
Not a happenstance.
Thank you. Something symbolic about that he wants to build something, make something grow, something new. So lots of symbolism here.
No, totally. The same sort of, I mean, it seems a little bit clumsy this many years later, but it's the same kind of symbolism with what does Fred end up doing? He's taking apart the machines of war to make a new life.
To build, I think, isn't it to build housing for veterans? So again, we're coming back to, we're going to help our fellow veterans rebuild their life and move on. I agree, though, Marsha, that the idea is to move on, leave the war behind, and do something new.
And to be part of the dismantling of it and the building of something new, which, and Christelle, you used this phrase, finding a purpose, and that's what happens with Fred, right? Again, in that beautiful scene where he's at the plane graveyard, and he's so just kind of moved by, obviously, without having a flashback, thinking about what he's been through. And then that opportunity arises when he meets the guy who's kicking him out of the plane because he's taking them apart to build prefab houses with, and the way he gets in there. I mean, this is the first time he really goes, okay, I can be part of the future. I can be part of something. And that's his finding a purpose.
It's very interesting how he, take his shirt off or his jacket off, and it's the body, he needs to find a physical thing, and we know this job is also going to be very physical. So there's also something interesting, being in the army of fighting, there's an element of physicality, which needless to say is connected to masculinity too. So doing a physical job is also going to give him back his masculinity.
Great
which
point.
brings me back to Homer. What is Homer doing? He's not doing anything. He's taking, his masculinity, I'm not sure is there. The only way to reinstate it is to having married.
Which is usually a convention for female characters, right? That's how, at the end of a melodrama, they are validated, is through marriage. And so it is interesting that there is a little bit of that. I don't know if it's it's a demasculinization, or it's a refusal to characterize him in the same kind of universe as his other colleagues who have come home from the war with him because, no doubt, of his disability.
Always an interesting way to analyze film is to break down some of the gender relations. We've talked sort of around them right now, but maybe devote a little more time directly to them. If you do read criticism of this film today, from a relatively modern perspective, a contemporary perspective, it's that the women are kind of cliched. They're one of two types. Most of them are extremely nurturing. And that's what they spend most of the movie doing, is nurturing. Then there's Marie, and she's not very nurturing at all. She's a good time girl who wants to go out and have a good time. I'm partial to Peggy. Peggy, hey, what are you doing, Peggy? I'm going to go break that marriage up. Peggy has her nurturing side and also sort of her bolder side. I think she's a pretty fully realized character. Is that criticism, that critique fair toward Best Years of Our Lives, that the women are kind of flat?
I mean, they certainly are not the most interesting characters in the film. Maybe that's the nicest way to put it, because, yes, they either fit into this kind of category of incredible acceptance and devotion and
there's a lot of women putting men to bed.
Yes, and really putting them back together again.
Covering them up and right.
Yeah,
I mean,
like children.
It's making them whole again. That's kind of their job. Or in Marie's case, kind of reminding them of how broken they are. But that's why she has to be, expelled from the narrative, and the good woman kind of back, who has the potential to kind of, who sees in Fred from the beginning his potential to be who he will become, no doubt, based on the way the film ends.
Industrial magnate in the prefab housing business,
Exactly.
we suspect.
Exactly.
Martin, put you on the spot. What do you think of gender relations in this movie, particularly the female characters?
I have to flow out of that Marsha's comments there. I think it's a little disappointing to see the meticulous effort put into building complex male characters and then almost minimal effort into the female characters, who are by and main pretty cardboard. And you'd really like to see that same complexity there, because you don't get that. You want to see the complexity of emotions, especially of Al's wife. You would love to see so much more from that particular character, because she's been running a household. She's, the children are obviously brilliant and successful children, and it's like, you'd like to see some complexity to that. And all we get is, I wish you'd have told me you were coming, so I could have cleaned up a little better. And to me, that character was particularly a little bit disappointing in the lack of complexity. And maybe for the period, it's less of a fret, except for the fact that the male characters are so beautifully developed.
That scene where they're doing the bar crawl, I was born in 1958, so I came of age as a movie watcher in the 70s, 80s, and you just expect Millie to explode at some point and say, "Get me home. What's wrong with you? Have you lost your mind?" She never does that. She sort of she tolerates what you would consider some pretty bad behavior that first night.
I do think it's interesting, though, at least in the reviews I've read from the time period, that there's really not a mention of how empty the female characters really are. Clearly, this is a film about men. It is about reintegrating them into their domestic spheres, certainly, but the emphasis, I mean, they are secondary from the get-go, and I think in a very intentional way, which is, not to say that that's not worthy of criticism, because I certainly think that it is, but I just don't think that the women were ever thought of as having the dimension as the male characters.
What does the film say about what it means to be a man? What's the image of masculinity here in this film?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think masculinity in this film ultimately is represented as a kind of returning to some kind of sense of kind of channeling that war era sense of a kind of accomplishment and autonomy and prowess and power, but filtering it into a kind of socially acceptable format where you're not
bombing Hamburg.
Exactly. Right. That's constructive instead of destructive. And, of course, the film, it doesn't resolve that. I mean, these men aren't all just, fixed at the end. You could imagine this film going on for another hour, like what happens next week and what happens next month and what happens next year, and I'm sure there's bumps along the road. But I do think it's about turning those kind of skills and that energy and into something positive.
Constructive rather than destructive.
Yeah, but I would... Then the way they can do that is through work, through the job. and through making sure they start recreating their own, heterosexual family nucleus. So it happens. I mean, kind of Hal has that. Again, if we assume the job, he continues, and we think at the end that Fred is going to have that. I don't know about Homer. He has the family. He doesn't have the job, but.
Is Al the pater familias? He the head of that family? It's hard to say. Myrna Loy strikes me as a pretty powerful character. She's the one who breaks down the marriage for their when it explains what marriage is like.
But I think it's about him coming. I mean, all of these men come home awkwardly, right? It's about becoming the heads of their worlds again and taking that control back. And in that way, it's very masculinist, I think, in its imagination of American culture, naturally, for 1946. But I mean, I think that their kind of tentativeness, their anxiety, their not wanting to go home, wanting to go home but not wanting to go home, I mean, that's all part of having to relearn how to be a man in this world as opposed to the world of war, which is combat's very different.
It is, and it's very hierarchical, and somebody tells you what to do. I mean, there's only one man, and he was in the White House, and we all know actually somebody was telling him what to do a lot of the time. The First Lady was a very powerful and important figure. However, these are men who've been ordered about, even a captain, right? Your bombardier is still subject to the orders of the captain and the pilot of the plane. And all of a sudden, they're meant to be independent.
Martin, I'm going to put you on the spot again, if you don't mind, because we're friends. You're an expert on the Vietnam War.
That is true.
As a Vietnam scholar, how's this film strike you in terms of reintegration of guys who've been seeing some pretty tough combat abroad and suddenly thrown back into civilian life?
I will say, I think we have to be careful in the way we apply that analogy, since we are talking about a 1940 film. At the same time, this does a much more nuanced job than most of the early Vietnam films, which are so clumsy and over the top.
Coming Home?
Yeah, I mean, the spitting on in the airport scenes and all this business, I mean, it becomes stereotyped. Whereas here we're dealing with archetypes and tropes, which I think actually have complexity. And, I mean, think Rambo, right? For crying out loud, Rambo was regarded as a Vietnam vet coming home film, a man with explosive arrows and a bandana around his head blowing up large parts of forests and small towns. I mean, when you compare that to this, I mean, this just seems like a beautiful piece of symphony done by a master versus, I don't know, let's say a Sex Pistols 2-minute song, which is what a lot of those early Vietnam War films were. I'm still waiting for a really, really good film that shows that integration. I mean, there's some brilliant work done on the Vietnamese side, both American Vietnamese and back in Vietnam, which have really looked at this, and people are that. They're complex, they're difficult, they're complicated. And I think that's why this is a film worth watching, that this captures some complexity in a way that later films fail to do.
Martin, I wonder, too, if part of that has to do with the fact that there are these three storylines. I mean, Rambo, Coming Home, I mean, the focus is so singular, and you can have a kind of complexity when you have three different characters who kind of, if you put them together, when you think about the veteran experience, I mean, that shows this kind of richness and diversity, and maybe that's just one of the things that's artful about the way that this was constructed.
Yeah, very much. A much smarter way to go about it.
What's interesting, I think the movie is also an anomaly because it's a master director. It's an excellent cinematographer. It's a great script writer. You mentioned 10 decade or two later it would be completely different. It's not even that much later that you start having film noir where you have really damaged World War II veteran, the Blue Dahlia or others. So I think it's very unusual in its kind of empathetic portrait of World War II veteran because of the crew that made it, the people that really participate. I mean, Wilder was very, very engaged in wanting to try to make as realistic as possible a depiction. And, we all know he did Memphis Belle and he did Mrs. Miniver, so he had some experience and he was personally involved and really, really tried hard. But I don't think there's a lot of good depiction of World War II veterans either. I think it's one of the best. It's probably the best depiction of World War II veterans we have.
America's been at war for much of its history. We've certainly made our share of war films. Really haven't made our share of films about what happens when soldiers come home. Subject we're living through right now. If anyone who's been in the higher education space in the last 10 or 15 years knows that some of these same problems are percolating up through society right now, and maybe waiting for their master filmmaker to kind of take a crack at them. We often have a go-round at the end of this, and we've talked so much about this film, but now we have to nail it all down. And the basic question is, do you like this film? Would you recommend this film?
Absolutely.
To whom?
Oh, to everybody. I think, well, actually, let me be more specific. I think this is one of those classic films that is often used to teach even filmmaking. I mentioned the cinematography earlier, and the script writing is a beautifully shot movie. It's very excellent. But as we mentioned, in terms of depiction of veteran, I think is very relevant nowadays too. I think a lot of Afghan of our Iraq veteran, I think, could recognize some of the same issues they're struggling with. So absolutely will recommend it.
Martin.
Yeah, same thing. I'll say I have a nephew that got back from Iraq a couple of weeks ago, and there's the first person I'd recommend take a look at this film.
Yeah, I mean, I have taught this film on a couple of occasions in classes on the war film. I think it's a very useful film to talk about in this context, in part because it's doing something really different than, if you think about the films that came before it and came after it that deal with war and with the consequences of war. I think this one is doing something spectacular. And, Christelle has mentioned the cinematography. So Greg Toland, who did the cinematography for this film, who worked on Citizen Kane, very important cinematographer. And the final scene, the wedding scene, where you have Homer successfully putting the ring on Wilma's finger. It's like this moment where everyone's holding their breath to see if he can actually do this or not. It's shot with this deep focus cinematography, so you can see all the reactions of all the characters you spent this time with at the end of this film, and that's a perfect example of a scene that's just shot so masterfully and really letting the audience kind of take the time to look around and see what's happening, not just to the characters in the foreground and the minister, but then also to all the characters whose lives have been kind of altered over the course of this film.
And I have to say, Rob, if I may jump in, people might be scared because the film is 2 hours and 40 minutes.
Doesn't feel like it.
It's exactly what I was going to say. It's so well paced. And I think it's rooted probably because we have three main characters and we follow, the stories are alternating and we follow them, but it's very well paced. You get into it, you want to know what's going to happen to those veterans, and then the time just flies. So don't be afraid of the time.
I like this film for many reasons, for the topic, for the way it deals with the very difficult subject matter. I also appreciate economy of storytelling, and you don't need 1,000 extras sometimes to tell a story. The scene early when Homer has to write down his name, and you realize that he doesn't have hands, and people are staring at him. He says, "What, you think I don't know how to write my own name?" or whatever he says. The whole movie is laid out there for you in a 30-second scene. It's extremely well done.
Well, and that actually brings up something we haven't talked about, which is there's a sense of humor in this film. I mean, the way we've been talking about it could sound very, very heavy, but in fact, there's these moments of great kind of comic bits and chopsticks. Yeah, we have Hoagie Carmichael playing the bar owner
in a star turn. Who knew?
I know. And even Homer comes up with this great line about how he was sick of having hands at one point when he's kind of reinventing his story about what happened to him. So it is not a humorless film.
No, it's very human, and people make light of even the darkest situation they're in. That's how we deal with these things. So I agree with you.
It's actually coming back to the Saint Marsha you just mentioned. It was interesting, Rob, you asked earlier about the Cold War area, and here we have this kind of gentleman who say, I'm so sad to see you because, we were misled, and the Limey and the Reds, basically, we entered the war, we were misled, and communists and so on. So the type of rhetoric that just barely 2 years later, the UAC hearing and so on started, and the anti-communist hysteria swept the country. So it's there. It's in the movie. There's so many. I've seen it probably 6 or 7 times, and every time I pick some new things. This is such a rich movie.
When Fred confronts that guy in the store, it's a scene of incredible violence. I mean, they must have choreographed that. It's not just a guy getting thrown into a cabinet. He's knocked over. You think he's been killed. They're talking about bring bandages. It's as if Fred has just dropped a bomb on the guy. Fred realizes he does have some wartime skills that may be applicable to certain horrible situations in civilian life. I was taken by that scene. It's just an incredibly violent scene.
Well, and it liberates him from the job he doesn't want.
Yes.
More importantly, right? He's not only defending his friend, standing up for his country, and kind of asserting his patriotism, but he gets out of the thing he didn't want to be in the first place.
And then you add this little shot where Homer pick up the pin, put it on, and again, this is Wyler saying this is what the real patriots are, not the one that question the war and talk about communism and whatever. Those are the one, stick to your friends and know what we fought for. So those little details, again, very interesting.
It's making a point about economy, too, and we've already mentioned that scene in the boneyard, this airplane graveyard. And I could think that in the hands of a lesser director than Wyler, Fred would have had a full-blown 15-minute flashback.
Right.
German fighter planes, flak, bombers going down in flames, and it never really happens.
No, it's subtle. I mean, it's very subtle. There's a single entry hole from small arms in the nose cone where he's sitting. Just one. And where it is, you know that probably the guy in the cone was killed. And that's all it takes.
But what's interesting is that when he gets into that plane, it's already all dusty. And for me, that was always, you guys just came back, and your whole experience, everything you went through, is the past. It's covered in dust. It has no value anymore.
And I think that decision not to do flashbacks in this film is about moving this narrative forward into the future and thinking about that and not dwelling in the past, which again may be something that's subject to some kind of critical consideration if you're wanting to erase people's traumatic, difficult memories of what they've just gone through. But that's the story that Wyler's telling.
The last thing traditionally we do, Service on Celluloid, is go around and sum this movie up in one sentence. Now that can be your reaction to it, your thoughts about its significance. We don't need a character plot summary, but who should we start with? The roving finger goes around. Martin Licano, my friend.
I've got 2 words for this one.
I'm waiting.
True fiction.
Christelle?
Mine is a little longer.
Well, that'll make up for Martin's short one.
I'll say it's masterfully shot, very well acted. It's a poignant depiction of some of the struggles that veterans faced, and I think it was right on time in 1946, but I think in 2018 and further, I think it will still be relevant for veterans and other people to watch. It's a classic.
Privilege of the visitor, Marsha.
Last, I would say I think Harold Russell is my kind of takeaway from this film, because that performance and his willingness to really share himself, that's what he's sharing in this film in some ways, even though it's a fictional film. He is the kind of documentary element in some ways, and I think his role and his performance in this is just phenomenal, and I think that's something that will always resonate with audiences.
I'll just end with a point I mentioned earlier. I think you have to watch this movie in tandem with It's a Wonderful Life, and this movie it's not really such a wonderful life. Frank Capra, in his own memoirs, thought he had nailed the Academy Award for Best Picture and Best Director that year, but unfortunately, William Wyler made the best years of our lives, and I think, for all the virtues of Capra's film, I think Wyler nailed it here, and so my one sentence would be, I guess it's not such a wonderful life. Thanks so much for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini episode next week, where we will share oral histories from those who were there. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible: our producer, Tessa Jagger, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.